During my brief YouTube comment conversation with the vegan lady,
humans are not designed to be carnivorous or omnivorous.
When I asserted that it was not within the mainstream scientific view that humans weren't omnivores, she replied that actually we know now that human beings evolved to eat tubers and not meat. And when I was listening to the Vegan Gains guy, the guy with the slender neck and the feminine frame and the feminine features, even though he is jacked up, I'll give him that, but his frame is that of a weakling. He talked about how meat was not important to our early diet, but it was cooking that allowed our brains to get glucose, he said, that allowed them to, develop better.
Human beings have made no physiological adaptations to eat meat, and the consensus among most anthropology experts is cooking our food is what supported our brain development, as it allowed us to eat a greater volume of food over a shorter period of time and extract more nutrients from our diet. Meat doesn't have anything to do with this, and there's also evidence that cooking starchy root vegetables was paramount to our brain development, as it supplied our brains with a constant stream of glucose.
And this common vegan idea about these things stems from a current sort of debate that's going on in the anthropological community. But I don't think the vegans understand the controversy, then I don't understand the issue. And I'll explain the issue. The issue is that they're trying to explain how Homo erectus, early Homo, was able to afford a large brain. Because if you look at Australopithecus had like a brain the size of very close to a modern chimp. They weren't very intelligent compared to Homo sapiens or compared to Homo erectus. And we know that the brain is an expensive resource, expensive organ. And so we know that they had access to more calories in order to be able to afford these brains. So the theory is that we know what Australopithecus was eating, and as Homo erectus began to emerge in the record, we know they would have to have access to more calories in order to sustain their larger brains and actually larger body frames. And so the controversy is what did they do new in their diet to be able to build these larger brains? What the controversy is not trying to figure out is how did they develop their diets. It's not a question of whether they ate meat or not, because Australopithecus, which is 1 million years older than Homo erectus, we know was omnivorous as well. So no one in the anthropological community is trying to figure out whether they ate meat or not. We already know that they did consume meat, and that they had their earliest ancestors before them, going back about 5 million years. We know that all these earlier primates were eating meat. The only thing the theory is trying to explain is what new in their diet is most responsible for them being able to have these excess calories to build larger brains. And there's 4 contending theories. And the first one is, the most commonly held one, is that they either the environment changed their behavior so that they had less access to the plant foods that they had before, and so they were forced to eat more meat, and because they were forced to eat more meat, they were successful at this, and thus they were able to get more calories. And so the high-fat, high-protein content of the meat that they were eating possibly allowed them to afford this new brain. But there's also contending theories. Perhaps it was, like the lady suggested, tubers, and the tubers aren't suggesting that we didn't eat meat. The tubers are just like, did they suddenly develop an ability to find these tubers and thus have access to a much richer food supply and have more calories? Another theory is sort of what the slender-necked vegan guy discussed was maybe it was cooking. But he talked about glucose, which, if you eat like fruits and stuff and cook your fruits, you're going to get some glucose, but you can also cook your meat and make it more easily digestible. And the theory behind the cooking thing is it actually takes a lot of calories to digest food. I mean, cows have to eat a lot of grass, but they have a lot of stomachs, which they can get a lot of the nutrients out of the grass, but they have to have these large stomachs, and these large stomachs take a lot of calories to sustain. So the mechanism by which you process calories can also cost calories in the process. So you need to find a balance where your calorie expenditure to process your new calories is erring on the side of you maximizing your production of resources. So the cooking thing is that early Homo developed fire and was able to cook his food. And what cooking your food does is it digests your food before you consume it. So it breaks it down into a more softer palate, so that you can once you put it in your body has to work less hard in extracting the new resources. And the other theory is it's not as widely held. I mean, meat's on top, then you have the tuber and the cooking thing, which are kind of, I think cooking is actually more ascribed to. The last one, which is kind of a rarity you'll find, but I still think it played a role. I mean, I think all these theories sort of, we can't know which one was more important, but I think they all played a role. The final one is that if let's say there's not a lot of meat, we can still forage for berries. If there's not a lot of berries, we should forage for more meat. And being able to eat a lot of different things means that even if something happens in the environment where one of these sources of food dies out, we can still, get the calories we need because we can eat a bunch of different things rather than being over-specialized. And when the vegan guy said that we were specialized to eat fruit,
And human beings happen to be specialized to eat fruit.
I think what he's talking about is that the early hominids sort of branched out into different specializations. One of them was this creature that developed a very large jawbone and very big teeth.
What about the hominids? Well, hominids are really interesting because they have big teeth. Bigger teeth than you might expect. Here is a Paranthropus third molar tooth. I think it's probably the biggest one in the assemblage as compared to a modern human tooth, and they're sitting right next to each other in the museum. Some of them have incredibly large teeth. They're called megadont. And Australopithecus as a group has big cheek teeth. Paranthropus as a group has huge molar teeth. And early Homo has, on average, smaller tooth sizes, especially from Homo erectus onward. We'll talk about what that means in just a moment.
It's that this big, thick jaw creature, kind of like a cow's jaw, was for chewing a lot of very fibrous foods. And this branched out from Australopithecus. So they were probably eating a lot of nuts or very fibrous plants that we'd have to really domesticate and change. Like, for instance, they could eat like freaking leaves off of trees like this, like right here, or they could eat like grass like a cow or stuff like that, or savanna grass, which is even drier and even rougher than the kind of grass you'll find in a cow pasture. And they had larger stomachs that were more specialized towards eating these fibrous plants. But our ancestors, early Homo erectus, their teeth got a lot smaller, and our guts got a lot smaller. And so what you can get from that is, we were supposed to eat soft fruits and maybe some nuts that we could use tools to get open with. But consistent with that is also that we ate a lot of meat, because if you look at strictly carnivorous creatures like lions or cats or whatever, they have small guts as well. The most important part of that theory is we were able to even cook our flesh, which allowed our guts to get smaller and less resource expensive, because we were able to cook the meat. So let's recap. Both of these vegans were sort of alluding to this one theory, but what they were taking from that theory is that the theory was trying to explain the diets of early hominids, and that's not what it's trying to do. The theory is trying to explain what new calorie source, because we know that Australopithecus, then to Homo erectus, had to had access to more calories because he grew, and especially the brain grew in size and became more expensive. So the same, like let's say, in order for you to get bigger than your ancestor, you got to eat more than your ancestor. You can't just grow without the fuel. So it's trying to explain what kind of fuel were they getting their access to. And the 4 different theories that I mentioned are just theories to try to explain which one was more important, not whether we eat meat or not. And I think that there's probably some body of vegan literature that misunderstands this theory and propagates this to their adherents, but I don't think that they really understand even the question, even what the theory is trying to explain. So I'm signing out. Vegan Gains Guys Weekly.
Cooking our food is what supported our brain development, as it allowed us to eat a greater volume of food, and the consensus among most anthropology experts is...
and there have been a variety of hypotheses. One suggestion is, well, meat.
Meat doesn't have anything to do with this.
They're omnivores, and meat can be a high protein food. If you get fatty meat, it has a lot of calories attached to it. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is tubers, and we'll talk a little bit more about roots this evening, but it turns out that roots are a fairly valuable commodity. We're used to potatoes, which are very starchy. We've domesticated roots. Wild roots in Africa are a lot more fibrous and harder to chew than any kind of the domestic potatoes we know about. And yet they contain a lot of carbohydrate, so they're potentially a great food resource. And there aren't that many wild animals that can get access to really deeply buried roots like tubers. There are pigs. There are little mole rats and things that dig up very shallow stuff, but digging down to get really tubers, it's this used resource that potentially, if our ancestors could have gotten access to tubers, perfect. They would have just had a bonanza. Another theory we'll talk about is the idea that perhaps it was cooking.
As it supplied our brains with a constant stream of glucose.
Cooking allowed us to process food in a way that increased its nutritional value and could support a big brain. Or perhaps brains we could afford, our ancestors could afford large brains because of our innate flexibility and the kind of dependable nature of our diet. Those are all possibilities we'll look at. Cooking comes in many guises. We'll think about that.
In the process of browsing YouTube, I came across a video that was criticizing the anti-fat shaming movement. The video was conducted by a vegan woman. I was not aware of her veganism until the end of the video when, after criticizing women for claiming being fat is okay, she stated,
Humans are not designed to be carnivorous or omnivorous. We are not designed to eat hyper-palatable, chemical-laden, processed junk food. We are designed to eat whole, high-carb plant foods. And it is through this diet that we find true health.
The woman responded back that it actually was a mainstream scientific view, and that this was sort of the standard view. And that's when I realized that there was something amiss here. There was something that's not quite right here. So my goal in this video is to, through just a hammer blow of vastly numerous sources, just put this idea into the category of myth that it is.
Humans today are omnivores. We eat a balance of animal and plant-derived foods. It has historically been really easy for us to look at the animal foods that people ate in the past, because when we eat animals, they leave their bones, and we find those bones in archaeological assemblages. But it can be much more difficult to look for evidence of plant foods in the past. Even though we know that living people descend from hunter-gatherers, and that ancient hunter-gatherers probably relied on plant foods for an important part of their diet, that component of their diet has been relatively invisible to us until recently.
We don't know whether Homo erectus or Augusta was merely a scavenger, or whether humans were now hunting large animals in their own right. Most experts believe that at this point, people were now commonly hunting medium and smaller-sized antelope. For example, Louis Leakey himself demonstrated that it was possible for a human to run down a small antelope and wrestle it to the ground. A dangerous pastime, but it can be done. There's no question that that sort of hunting went on from the earliest times. There's no question that that sort of hunting went on from the earliest times.
Early Homo sapiens, these guys were much more mobile over the entire surface of the Near East. They were going from one place to another. Sometimes they perhaps even went to the deserts to spend some time. So their knowledge of geography, their knowledge of their environment was much better and more elaborated than that of the Neanderthals. Neanderthals were different. They were hanging more or less all around in their own cave or around the cave, getting the raw material for making stone tools, hunting, plant collecting, and so on. They were much more local, stationary guys. Anytime they needed a mate, they probably went to the next door cave.
In Europe, there is evidence of Homo sapiens moving into Neanderthal territory some 40,000 years ago.
If we look at Europe between 30 and 40,000 years ago, I think we see evidence of an economic competition, a competition for the resources between Neanderthals and early modern humans. The Neanderthals had been long established there, but suddenly there was another kind of human there competing for the same resources, one which probably had an edge, maybe only a small edge, in terms of economic survival and economic abilities to exploit the resources better than the Neanderthals could do.
Archaeologist Paul Bond spent years looking for exactly these kinds of subtle advantages. He's discovered a revealing pattern. Nearly all the Homo sapiens sites are located up on hilltops. In the town of Foix in France, Homo sapiens sites were found on the hilltop where the chateau now stands.
People living up on high ridges like this one, they would have had an enormous advantage in being able to survey vast areas of land as from this spot where you can see so far to the north and south. This would have given them great advantages in being able to plan their hunting strategies, being able to see the herd movements and plan well in advance what they could do about it.
And at the time that the cave was being occupied, the way that the topography of the land is, there was no trench, and the entrance to the caves was through various openings, but one of the openings that occurred fairly frequently was as the limestone kept dissolving and breaking away, eventually the top of the cave would collapse, and there would be a hole. Sometimes that hole might be a graded hole, and you might have vegetation growing all over. So an animal such as this bison here might have tripped and fallen in, which was the dinner bell not only for the inhabitants, but also for other denizens of the area.
There are the results. The microwear suggests a softer or tougher food diet in Australopithecus, on average. The isotopes suggest a mixed diet of forest and savanna resources. So far, so good. Paranthropus, the microwear of some look like broader diets, including some harder foods, but for others, looks like they tended to focus more on softer or tougher foods. The isotopes of those that had broad diets according to the microwear seem to have mixed diets in terms of where they were eating, in the forest and savanna. The soft, tough item eaters, on the other hand, ate mostly savanna foods. So two different signals. For early Homo, the microwear suggests a mixed diet of softer, tougher, and harder foods, and the isotopes suggest a mixed diet of forest and savanna resources. So that's where we are at this point.
We can also determine whether or not a species is specialized to eat foliage, fruit, or meat by comparing their functional body size to their absorptive area.
Okay, what do we know? Australopithecus likely ate mostly softer or tougher foods, things like fruits and leaves, in a mixed setting between about 4 and 2 million years ago, but could handle a fairly broad diet. Around 2.5 million years ago, there's a fork in the evolutionary road. In one direction, our Paranthropus cousins were more specialized and likely had different diets in different places. Some ate tough savanna foods like grasses and sedges, whereas others included more hard items in their diet, such as nuts and seeds in a mixed setting. Finally, our early Homo ancestors had less specialized teeth.
And human beings happen to be specialized to eat fruit.
Finally, our early Homo ancestors had less specialized teeth and probably had a broader and more variable diet, including both savanna and forest resources, likely with more meat in their diets.
But were they getting any meat with that? The evidence for meat doesn't come from the teeth because it doesn't really leave tooth wear. The evidence for meat comes from archaeological sites, and you're probably all familiar with the world's oldest stone tools are about 2.5 million years old. And they're associated with, they're basically simple cutting and pounding tools. And they're often associated at these sites with the remains of animals that have been either smashed open for marrow, the long marrow bones, or sometimes they've been cut with stone tools. And so this has produced this notion of meat eating in human evolution. And yet these are archaeological sites. And yet the archaeological sites don't preserve any plant foods. They're just, they rot away. And so we're left from the archaeology wondering what the plant foods could have been. And we know they must have eaten plant foods because primates eat plant foods and we're descended from primates. And there are lots of plant foods in the East African landscape. I spent a number of years collecting plant foods in the East African landscape. So they're there. So trying to sort out the kinds of foods that would have been palatable and available to hominids over the course of a year that might have been chewable. Here you have honey, which is a kind of a processed plant food, if you will. One of these things that so much of our archaeology suggests we had this reliance on tools and meats, and yet there's a whole part of the diet of these guys that just isn't preserved archaeologically, and we sort of have to turn to the fossils to look at. The other thing, and it's wonderful to see bits of Jane Goodall on the film beforehand, because her leadership has led to a new generation of studies among primatologists that really can give us a much broader context for interpreting the early archaeological evidence as well as the paleontological evidence from understanding of primate behavior today. And if you look at the balance in living chimps, they love, many populations, they love to hunt, they love the taste of meat.
Meat doesn't have anything to do with this.
They're trying to get as much meat as they can. You could argue that it has more social valence than it has nutritional importance. And they, of course, rely on plant foods. And then recently, the wonderful work at the Fongoli site, where it's one of those little refrigerator magnets as you were coming in, the Leakey Foundation, sort of celebrating the fact that we now have evidence of chimps actually using tools to hunt little bush babies in these dry areas in West Africa. Wonderful new evidence from dry areas in East Africa, in Tanzania, not far from Gombe, a little site called Ugala, where they've recently found evidence for chimpanzees digging fairly shallow holes with different kinds of sticks, digging up little roots and things. So, you know, we're not the only creatures that go for meat and potatoes. It looks like chimps from time to time will as well.
So here's dinner on the savannah. And it wasn't easy because these early individuals, these early hominids, only had simple stone tools. And they could butcher animals, but mostly they scavenged. And they had to, while they were doing that, they had to fend off various other animals like hyenas and jackals and vultures, all pretty nasty critters. And the big question is, once they got the meat, did they have fire? Could they eat meat? And animal bones clearly show cut marks made with stone tools. So we know that they cut up animal carcasses to eat meat. But it's only been recently that a date for domestication of fire by Homo erectus has come up at 1 million years ago. So early hominins such as Homo ergaster, which are older than that, about 2 million years old, they probably ate their meat raw.
Meat doesn't have anything to do with this.
And, well, I give him full credit for inventing fire, but what's he done since? Just sitting around.
This year's lectures, Bones, Stones, and Genes, The Origin of Modern Humans, will be given by Dr. John Shea, Professor of Anthropology at Stony Brook University.
The consensus among most anthropology experts is
in this, our first snapshot, things look, well, different from today. There are no metal tools, there's no writing, no cities. Sounds fine to me. But the world of 5,000 years is not unrecognizable. They're familiar things. The largest sites are villages, or a few hundred people, located near sources of fresh water, rivers and streams. The larger settlements subsist on domesticated plants and animals, or wheat, barley, rice in terms of plants, and sheep, goat, cattle, pigs, this sort of thing in the case of the animals. So let's go back 30,000 years ago. Well, at 30,000 years ago, the world looks very different from 5,000 years ago. But most of the differences simply reflect economics. All humans living 30,000 years ago are hunter-gatherers. There are neither domesticated plants nor domesticated animals. Let's go back 500,000 years ago. 500,000 years ago, things look really different from 30,000 years ago. There are no humans around, only earlier hominins such as Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus. Sites from this period, archaeological sites from this period, lack evidence for architecture, and traces of fire are really quite rare. Many sites show evidence for carnivore activity.
Humans are not designed to be carnivorous or omnivorous.
This suggests hominins were competing with wolves, lions, leopards, and similar sorts of creatures for access to animal carcasses or for control of protected habitation sites like caves. There's little evidence for the systematic gathering of small mammals, fish, birds, and these sorts of things. And that makes a certain amount of sense. Small groups of people tend to focus on big animal prey. If you chose to stay here, your life, as Hobbes put it, would be solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Let's go back even further. 2 million years ago, we're looking at an utterly alien landscape. Hominin fossils from this time period include early Homo, Australopithecus, and Paranthropus, creatures very different from any living primate. Most sites are merely aggregations of stone tools and animal bones near the banks of rivers and lakes, or less often in caves. There's no evidence for the controlled use of fire and no evidence for architecture. Imagine camping out in this environment. The only stone tools we find are mode 1 pebble cores and flakes, little chips struck off of the cores. Now, cut marks on animal bones indicate that some of these tools were used for butchering large mammal carcasses. Now, but we don't know whether these are carcasses that the hominins killed themselves or carcasses that were obtained by scavenging from the kills of carnivores.
In terms of evolutionary biology, he's not exactly one of the usual suspects. As you can see here, a dark-skinned, dark-haired, blue-eyed European hunter-gatherer from around 7,000 years ago. So what's so strange about that? Well, typically scientists have thought of European hunter-gatherers from the Mesolithic era as light-skinned with darker eyes, kind of like the Flintstones. But according to researchers from the Spanish National Research Council, this particular ancient man bucked both trends by having a combination of African and European genes, which led to dark skin and light eyes. Quoted by CNN, the study's lead researcher said the biggest surprise was to discover that this individual possessed African versions in the genes that determine the light pigmentation of the current Europeans, which indicates that he had dark skin, although we cannot know the exact shade. According to The Guardian, another surprise was that the ancient man was already carrying mutations in his immune system that weren't thought to have evolved until humans started living together in farming communities. Those mutations were confounded by the fact that he was believed to be lactose intolerant and likely had trouble digesting starchy foods, common characteristics of hunter-gatherers from the period.
Erectus is the Superman of his day, but how does he fare against a tough competitor? Near Swartkron, South Africa, evidence reveals that Erectus lived alongside another early human called Robustus. Paleoanthropologist Lucinda Backwell is studying Robustus. Her recent discoveries tell us what kind of rival he was. Like Erectus, Robustus solved a critical problem: eating enough protein to power his large brain. Brain tissue burns 16 times more calories than muscle tissue at rest. Erectus probably got his protein by scavenging for meat.
But I don't see a correlation between meat eating and intelligence.
If Backwell finds that Robustus was also eating meat, it may be a clue that Robustus and Erectus competed head-to-head for the same food. Experts long believed Robustus was a plant-chewing simpleton, not in the same league as Erectus. But a recent chemical analysis of Robustus's fossils suggests he was somehow eating animal protein. Where and what was he hunting?
The environment when Erectus and Robustus lived here was really very much the same as today. The carnivores at the time were lots of hyena, all of the big cats, leopard, panthers, lion. It was a very dangerous environment. These ape men that were living here were really the hunted. They were the prey of the carnivores.
So Erectus and Robustus were the hunted. On the way to getting enough protein, they also had to dodge predators. Clues to how Robustus got his protein are hidden in bone tools discovered near his fossils. To find out how Robustus used his tools, Backwell makes duplicates for a field test. Then she digs for tubers. Erectus probably did this, so why not Robustus too? Then she searches for insects, gouging the tree bark. Finally, she digs for termites. Like a crime scene investigator, she compares resin casts of the ancient Robustus tools and her own tools from her field experiments. The scratch-by-scratch comparison gives her a break in the case. The marks from termite digging look like those on the ancient tools of Robustus.
It was a very clear match. We think Robustus was the user of these tools and that he was using them to forage for termites.
Chimps are renowned for using twigs to probe for termites. But chimps gather termites only in the rainy season, exploiting holes created by the termites themselves as they leave their nests. But Robustus, with his stronger tool, could break into the concrete hard mud year-round.
It's interesting because 100 grams of fish, that gives one 74 calories. 100 grams of steak gives one 340 calories. And the same amount of termites, 560 calories. So they're full of fat and protein.
So if Robustus didn't eat red meat, he didn't compete directly with Erectus. What was their relationship?
When one considers that these two ape men are living on the same hill, it's of course really fascinating and tantalizing.
Two early humans lived here. Both found animal protein. Both were smart, but one may not have been smart enough.
It must have been kind of like that television show Survivor, where everyone's trying to get as much out of the environment as they can at any one time, and they're trying to outcompete and outsurvive the other one. And one of them eventually doesn't.
Evidence found in Erectus's fire pit indicates that Robustus wasn't his rival at all. Instead, he may have been his prey. Disturbingly, among the charred fossils, researchers found a finger bone of Robustus.
Get fucked, you dirty hippie!